We also have a lot of rules about visitation and about when you are allowed to have people of the opposite sex in your dorm room. Until we get to the 60s, you can have visitation between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. on Sunday, and the dorm must certainly remain open. And students are responsible for enforcing this rule. Dorm presidents are in charge, and SAs are in charge of catching people at doing illegal visitation and writing them up. And so, to some extent, some students decide they don't really want to enforce it, but basically this is a self-governing rule, regardless of how strange it seems to us now. And then dorm councils are the people who punish people who broke the rule. So if you break a rule in your dorm, you go to dorm councils. You're judged by your peers. It fits the model of self-governance very nicely. And then beyond that, more serious cases get referred to the Faculty Committee on Student Affairs, which is a group of faculty who is in charge of governing the student life rules and for also administrating punishments to students who have broken them. Students can be suspended for having their out-of-town girlfriends stay with them for the night. Two students go off, some girl kind of moves in with her boyfriend off campus, and students are getting suspended for this. Even in a time where getting suspended and not being enrolled in school has the danger of being drafted and getting sent to Vietnam. That's how seriously this rule has taken, and kind of a big idea of how fast we change by the time we get to 1969. Every spring at North Campus Weekend, starting kind of in the early 50s, there's a weekend in which there are open dorms on North Campus for the weekend. So all Saturday and all day Sunday, you can have a girl in your dorm room. And this is a big deal, and so it kind of gives you a sense of the way the rules work at this time. But students generally agree with the administration that girls need to be protected, and that open dorms would be a big problem. There are a lot of emotional problems that come with the idea that, some girl could feel it necessary to invite the boy back to the dorm room. And so that students really buy into the same ideas as a generation older than them. And so then we get to the 60s. And then students have totally different ideas about sexuality, gender, and especially student power. So the people who, told me when I was a first year that self-governance started in the 60s were partially right in saying that the 60s is a critical moment in the redefinition of self-governance and in the abolishment of the idea of in loco parentis. In less than 3 years, we go from President Leggett asserting that the administration should act as a parent and refusing to increase the hours of co-ed visitation, to students declaring home rule, saying that we have self-governance, and convincing President Leggett to decide that they can decide for themselves when people of the opposite sex can visit them in their rooms. So the generation gap in the 60s creates a situation in which self-governance and in loco parentis can no longer coexist. And at Grinnell, where this student power debate goes on, it's really all about the different ideas about gender and sex that cause students to assert their right to self-governance. It's really the topic of visitation that provides the umbrella framework for this idea. So my research is focusing on this change in self-governance in the 60s, and the assertion of students that they have the right to govern themselves and that in loco parentis is not a useful system in this new world where they don't have the same ideas as the generation above them. Leggett comes to Grinnell in 1965. He's about to get a rude awakening to Grinnell students. But he comes in 1965 and he says, I don't believe in loco parentis. He makes some joke in his inauguration speech and says, I look too old to be anybody's parent. And so he, in 1965, right before all this happens, we're really in a place where he thinks that these students and administrations believe in the same thing, and if he gets rid of in loco parentis, nobody's going to do anything too shocking anyway. A year later, he learns that this is definitely not true. So, in the fall of 1966, SGA and the administration go off on encampment. It's a retreat, it happens every year. Everyone goes off to Boone, Iowa, or some camp like that, and discusses the various issues that are going on with students. SGA and the Council of Hall President, Women's Board, come back from this encampment, and the S&B publishes this special edition in which they talk about all the big issues they brought up. This is kind of the very first time we get a real articulation of the fact that women want unrestricted hours and no more curfews, and that students in general want an extension of open dorm hours. At At a discussion of this paper, the S&B says that student support seemed unanimous for some sort of extension of open dorms on a daily basis. Later that fall, in November, student government stages a protest in Gates Hall. After 3 students have been suspended for illegal visitation by the Faculty Committee on Student Affairs, the leaders of student government are dissatisfied with the response of the administration. They don't think they're getting anywhere by talking to them, and decide to spend the night in the SGA president's room in Gates Hall. The SGA president at that time is Steve Kent, and he says that the administration officials have so far virtually ruled out the possibility of change in this policy and have refused to discuss the problem formally. And so they have a sleep-in, and they all spend the night hanging out in Gates Tower reading Dante. Which I find highly entertaining. The next morning, they sign their own apprehensions. Rob Foote is the head of the Council of Hall Presidents. This is kind of a great way of thinking about the fact that the structures of self-governance already exist. They've staged this protest, and then they have to get themselves in trouble because students are responsible for enforcing their own rules. So that kind of reminds us how much self-governance is really in play. And this gets a whole lot of attention. 700 students fill the auditorium upstairs in ARH to talk about visitation. Now, Leggett's views on in loco parentis have changed. The S&B writes, based on Leggett's response, the S&B writes, obviously President Leggett has changed his view, or else he is conveniently not letting it affect his administration of the college. This matter is a clear-cut case of penalizing students for failure to conform to a set moral code determined by college officials. We're getting that articulation of the healing of generation gap right here. And Leggett wasn't on campus during this protest, but he comes back, and he really articulates this fear of this widening generation gap. He says it used to be that if a boy spent the night with a girl, they would be immediately expelled and no questions asked. And he admits that his position on the loco parentis has certainly changed. And he claims that what a college wants is homogeneity in academic and moral standards. So because of these differing ideas and values, Leggett cannot let self-governance coexist with his feeling of responsibility to act as the students' parents. So then students come back from fall break in the spring of '67, and they discover that the administration has canceled weekend opens, and that on North Campus weekend, this 10-year tradition of having open visitation hours all day Saturday and Sunday isn't going to happen. The administration is clearly trying to maintain its sense of the rules. And the deans do not discuss this decision with student government. SGA is really, really mad that nobody talked to them. This really just sets students off. And S&B articles about this issue really suggest that students are concerned with the principle of the decision, more so than they are simply concerned about the few hours they were going to have on the weekend. They're upset because they're supposed to have self-governance, and these decisions were made without their input. At a speech in the student senate, one student picks up on the idea that Self-Gov is already in the catalog and that it's something we have to stick to. The senator says, the premise in the catalog of a closely knit community, self-government, and education considered as an organic whole have not been realized, and the attitudes that serve to stifle these objectives can no longer be tolerated by responsible students of this college. There are calls to revolt in Senate. There are angry letters to the editor in the S&B. 2 students in an opinion piece of the S&B articulate this generation gap problem. They say, we feel that the wide disparities that exist between the educational, social, and moral philosophies of the members of the Grinnell community must be discussed, debated, and reconciled anew.